Stillwater, a town forged in grit and dreams. Stillwater, Oklahoma, 1898. A town where the promise of fertile land clashes with the harsh realities of frontier life. Nestled beside the winding Stillwater Creek, it's a place where dreams are as vast as the open sky, but danger lurks in every shadow. Newcomers arrive with hope in their hearts, seeking a fresh start, but they soon discover that survival demands resilience, courage, and an unwavering spirit. In this land of opportunity and peril, fortunes are won and lost, alliances are forged and broken, and the bonds of family are tested to their limits. Stillwater is more than just a town. It's a crucible where the American West is being shaped, one struggle, one love story, one act of defiance at a time. Chapter 1. A New Beginning. The sun hung low in the Oklahoma sky, casting a golden glow over the endless prairie. The wagon creaked as it rolled along the dirt road, its wheels crunching over the dry earth. Cody Wagner sat tall in the driver's seat, his broad shoulders squared and his weathered hands steady on the reins. Beside him, Jan Wagner clutched her bonnet against the breeze, her auburn hair catching the sunlight. Behind them, their 4 daughters, Emma, Sarah, Mona, and Leanne, sat on the back of the wagon, their laughter rising above the rhythmic clatter of the wheels. "Look at it, Jan," Cody said, his voice filled with awe. "This is it. This is what we've been working for." Jan followed his gaze. The land stretched out before them, a sea of green grass and wildflowers swaying in the breeze. The Stillwater Creek shimmered in the distance, its calm currents winding through the property like a silver thread. And there, nestled among the rolling hills, stood their new home, a 2-story ranch house with a wide wraparound porch, its white paint gleaming in the afternoon sun. "It's beautiful, Cody," Jan said softly, her voice catching. "More than I ever dreamed." From the back of the wagon, Emma, the eldest at 24, leaned forward, her dark curls bouncing as she squinted at the house. "I call the room with the biggest window," she declared, her voice full of excitement. "Not if I get there first." Mona, the 3rd daughter, shot back, her freckled face lighting up with a mischievous grin. "Girls, there's plenty of house for everyone," Jan said, though her tone was more amused than stern. "Plenty of work, too," Cody added with a chuckle. "This ain't no city life. We've got fences to mend, cattle to raise, and a ranch to run. Everyone's got to pull their weight." "Don't worry, Pa," Sarah said, her voice steady and confident. At 22, she was the most practical of the sisters, with a sharp mind and a knack for organization. "We'll make it work, together." Leanne, the youngest at 18, rolled her eyes. "As long as I don't have to shovel anything out of the barn, I'm happy." The family's laughter filled the air as they pulled up to the house. Cody jumped down from the wagon, his boots kicking up dust as he helped Jan and the girls climb down. The scent of fresh grass and wildflowers mingled with the earthy aroma of the creek, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. The next morning, the Wagners hitched up the wagon and made their way into Stillwater. The town was small but bustling, with wooden buildings lining the main street. The general store stood at the center, its wide windows displaying everything from sacks of flour to bolts of fabric. A bell jingled as the family stepped inside, drawing the attention of the store's proprietor, a stout man with a bushy mustache. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice booming. "You must be the Wagners. Word travels fast in these parts. I'm Henry Grayson, and this here's my store. Welcome to Stillwater." "Thank you, Mr. Grayson," Cody said, shaking the man's hand. "We're glad to be here." The girls wandered through the store, marveling at the shelves stocked with goods. Emma struck up a conversation with a young woman about her age, while Mona and Leanne giggled over a display of brightly colored ribbons. Sarah, ever the practical one, examined a ledger book, already thinking about how to keep track of the ranch's expenses. As Jan chatted with Mr. Grayson about supplies, a group of townsfolk gathered near the counter, their voices low but not low enough to escape the Wagners' ears. "Did you hear? The Wagners' land has the Stillwater Creek running right through it," one woman whispered. "Prime land for cattle," another man said. "Bet there's folks who'd pay a pretty penny for it, or take it if they had to. Cody's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Jan placed a reassuring hand on his arm, her eyes meeting his. They both knew that building a life out here wouldn't be easy, but they were determined to make it work. Settling in back at the ranch, the family got to work. Cody and the ranch hands began repairing fences and preparing the barn for the cattle that would arrive in a few weeks. Jan and the girls cleaned and organized the house, turning it into a warm, welcoming home. Emma and Mona worked together in the kitchen, their banter lightening the mood as they scrubbed pots and arranged dishes. Sarah took charge of the pantry, her meticulous nature ensuring that everything was in its place. Leanne, meanwhile, found herself drawn to the barn, where she struck up a conversation with one of the ranch hands, a young man named Andy. Andy was tall and broad-shouldered, with a quiet confidence that made him stand out. He showed Leanne how to saddle a horse, his hands steady and sure. Sarah watched from a distance, her heart skipping a beat. She quickly turned away, focusing on her work, but the image of Andy's easy smile lingered in her mind. That evening, as the family gathered on the porch to watch the sunset, Cody leaned back in his chair, a contented smile on his face. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us," he said, his voice steady. "But this is our home now, and we're going to make it the best ranch in Stillwater." The girls nodded, their faces glowing in the golden light. For the first time, they felt the weight of what they had taken on, but also the promise of what lay ahead. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the Wagners sat together, their laughter mingling with the sounds of the prairie. It was a new beginning, full of hope and possibility. But in the shadows, unseen and unspoken, danger lurked. The Wagners' land was valuable, and not everyone in Stillwater was happy to see them there. The first chapter sets the stage for the Wagners' journey, introducing their new life, the challenges they'll face, and the relationships that will shape their story. The vast Oklahoma prairie is both a promise and a threat, and the Wagners will need all their strength, and each other, to survive. Chapter 2. The Heart of Stillwater. The morning sun rose over the Wagner ranch, casting long shadows across the fields of wildflowers that swayed like blades of glory in the gentle breeze. The Stillwater Creek sparkled in the distance, its calm currents a soothing reminder of the promise this land held. Cody Wagner stood on the porch, his hands resting on his hips as he surveyed the property. The house was coming together, the barn was sturdy, and the land was ripe for cattle. But today wasn't about work. It was about meeting the people of Stillwater. "Girls, let's get a move on," Cody called, his deep voice carrying through the open windows of the house. Inside, the Wagner sisters were a flurry of activity. Emma was brushing her dark curls in front of the mirror, her sharp blue eyes scanning her reflection critically. "Do you think this dress makes me look too drab?" she asked Sarah, who was tying her hair back with a simple ribbon. "You always look drab," Mona teased. Her freckled face smirked as she looked at her through the corner of her eyes. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, pulling on her boots. "Maybe try smiling for once." Emma glared at her. "I'll smile when you stop stealing my ribbons." Leanne, the youngest, burst into laughter as she twirled in front of the mirror, her light brown hair catching the sunlight. "I think we all look just fine. Besides, it's just a trip to town. Who are we trying to impress anyway?" "Everyone!" Emma and Mona said in unison, their voices dripping with sarcasm. Sarah rolled her eyes but couldn't help smiling. "Let's just get going before Pa comes in here and drags us out himself." The wagon rattled as they pulled up to the general store in Stillwater. The town was bustling with activity. Horses tied to hitching posts stamped their hooves, and the smell of fresh bread wafted from the bakery. The general store stood at the heart of it all. Through its wide windows, you could see the whole town. As the Wagners stepped inside, the bell above the door jingled, and all eyes turned to them. The store was filled with townsfolk, women browsing bolts of fabric, men discussing the latest cattle prices, and children tugging at their mothers' skirts. "Well, if it isn't the new folks," said Henry Grayson, the store's proprietor, with his huge mustache grinning. Welcome back, folks. What can I do for you today? Cody stepped forward, shaking the man's hand. Just picking up some supplies and getting to know the town a little better. Jan smiled warmly. We're hoping to meet some of our neighbors. You've come to the right place, Henry said, gesturing around the store. This here is where all the news and gossip flows. If you want to know anything, you'll find out about it right here. As Cody and Jan chatted with Henry, the girls made their way across the store. Emma struck up a conversation with a young woman about her age, who introduced herself as Clara. They bonded over a shared love of books, and Emma found herself relaxing in Clara's easy company. Meanwhile, Mona and Leanne were drawn to a display of brightly colored ribbons. I think this one would look perfect on you, Mona said, holding up a deep blue ribbon. Leanne grinned. And this one would match your freckles, she teased, holding up a bright yellow ribbon. Sarah, the practical one, found herself drawn to the shelves of ledgers and notebooks. As she flipped through a sturdy ledger, she felt a presence beside her. Planning to keep the ranch running all by yourself? A deep voice asked. Sarah looked up to see a young man with sandy blonde hair, big blue eyes, and a crooked smile. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his hands rough from work. I like to be prepared, Sarah replied. Her tone was cool and collective. The man chuckled. I'm Andy. I work for the Wagners. Well, I guess that means I work for you too. Sarah raised an eyebrow. You're one of the ranch hands? That's right, Andy said, his smile widening. And if you ever need help with anything, just let me know. Sarah felt a blush starting to form on her cheeks, but quickly turned her attention back to the ledgers. I'll keep that in mind. As a smile began to form, as the girls explored the store, snippets of conversation floated through the air. Did you hear about the Wagners' land? One woman whispered to another. Prime property, the other replied. That creek running through it makes it worth a fortune. I wouldn't be surprised if someone tried to buy it out from under them. Or worse, the first woman said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. Sarah overheard them talking and felt a chill run down her spine. She glanced at Andy, who was watching her with a curious expression. Something wrong? He asked. Sarah shook her head. No, it's nothing. But the unease lingered. By the time the Wagners left the store, their wagon was loaded with supplies, and their hearts were a little lighter. The townsfolk had been very kind and welcoming, and the girls had each made a new acquaintance. As they rode back to the ranch, the sun dipped low in the sky. Cody glanced back at his daughters, their laughter filling the air, and felt a swell of pride in that he made the right decision. This is it, he said to Jan, his voice quiet but firm. This is the life we dreamed of. John reached over and squeezed his hand. And we'll make it work, together. But as the wagon rolled toward the ranch, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their new life wouldn't be as peaceful as they hoped. The whispers in the store, and the way Andy had looked at her, it all felt like the beginning of something she couldn't quite name. For now, though, she pushed the thoughts aside and joined in her sister's laughter. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as a family. And as the wildflowers swayed in the breeze, their vibrant colors catching the last rays of sunlight, the Wagners' ranch stood tall and proud, a beacon of hope in the vast Oklahoma prairie. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Wind. The Oklahoma sun was high in the sky over the Wagner Ranch, vibrant colors painting the landscape like a masterpiece. The Stillwater Creek glimmered in the distance, its calm currents a soothing presence amidst the hard work of the day. Cody Wagner stood by the barn, his hat tipped low over his brow as he inspected the newly repaired fence. That should hold for now, he said, his voice steady, but we'll need to reinforce it before the cattle arrive. Already on it, Pa, Sarah called from the other side of the field. She was hammering a post into the ground, her sleeves rolled up and her face flushed from the effort. Nearby, Mona and Leanne were supposed to be helping, but their laughter echoed across the field as they chased each other with handfuls of wildflowers. Girls! Jan called from the porch, her hands on her hips. If you're not going to help, At least stay out of the way. Emma was inside the house, scrubbing the kitchen floor. She had volunteered for the task, claiming it was better than dealing with her sister's antics. The day was peaceful, but there was an undercurrent of tension that none of them could quite shake. The whispers they had overheard in town still lingered in their minds, a reminder that not everyone was happy about their presence in Stillwater. As the afternoon wore on, a rider approached the ranch. It was Sheriff Tom Hargrove, his grizzled face set in a grim expression. Cody met him at the gate, his hand resting on the fence post. "Afternoon, Sheriff," Cody said, tipping his hat. "What brings you out this way?" The sheriff dismounted, his boots kicking up dust as he walked over. "Just thought I'd check in," he said. "Heard some talk in town that's got me worried." Cody's jaw tightened. "Talk? What kind of talk?" "Folks are saying your land's too good to be true," the sheriff said, his voice low. "That creek running through it makes it prime property for cattle. There's some who think it'd be better off in someone else's hands." Cody's eyes widened. "Are you saying someone might try to take it from us?" The sheriff nodded. "I'm saying you should be careful. I know y'all are new in town, but keep an eye on your fences, your livestock, and your family. There's folks around here who don't play fair." Cody's grip on the fence post tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Thanks for the warning, Sheriff. We'll be ready." The sheriff tipped his hat and mounted his horse. "You're good people, Cody. I'd hate to see anything happen to you or your family." As the sheriff rode off, Cody turned to see Jan watching from the porch. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. "What did he say?" she asked. Cody walked over and took her hand. "Nothing we didn't already know. But we'll be fine, Jan. This is our home, and we're not giving it up without a fight." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the Wagner sisters gathered on the porch. The air was cool, and the sky was orange and pink. Emma was reading a book, her legs tucked under her as she sat in the rocking chair. Mona and Leanne were braiding each other's hair, their laughter soft and easy. Sarah sat on the steps, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Penny for your thoughts?" a voice said behind her. Sarah turned to see Andy standing there, his hat in his hands and the same crooked smile on his face. "Just thinking about everything we have to do," she said, her voice quiet. Andy sat down beside her, his presence warm and steady. "You're doing a good job, you know. Your pa's proud of you. We all are." Sarah glanced at him, her heart skipping a beat. "Thanks, Andy. That means a lot." They sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the prairie filling the air. "You ever think about what brought you here?" Andy asked. Sarah nodded. "All the time. Pa always said this was the life he wanted for us, a place where we could build something that would last." Andy smiled. "Sounds like he's a smart man." "He is," Sarah said, her voice soft. "But it's not just him. It's all of us. We're in this together." Andy looked at her, his blue eyes steady. "You're stronger than you think, Sarah. Don't forget that." Sarah felt a blush rise to her cheeks again, but she didn't look away this time. "Thanks, Andy. I won't." As the stars began to appear in the sky, the Wagner sisters and Andy sat together on the porch, their laughter mingling with the sounds of the prairie. But in the distance, a shadow moved, a reminder that their new life in Stillwater was far from secure. Chapter 4. Shadows and Sparks. The Wagner Ranch was alive with the sounds of work and laughter. The sun hung low in the sky, glowing over the fields of wildflowers that stretched as far as the eye could see. The beautiful Stillwater Creek shimmered in the distance, its calm currents a constant reminder of the land's beauty and its danger. Cody Wagner stood by the barn, taking a break as he watched his daughters work. Emma was in the garden, her dark curls tied back as she knelt in the dirt, planting rows of vegetables. Mona and Leanne were by the creek, their laughter carrying on the breeze as they tried to catch fish with their bare hands. Sarah, as always, was in the thick of things, helping the ranch hands repair a section of the fence that had been damaged overnight. "Looks like someone's been testing us," Cody muttered under his breath. Jan appeared beside him, her auburn hair catching the sunlight. "What is it?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "Fence was cut again," Cody said, obviously annoyed. "Whoever's doing this wants us to know they're watching." Jan placed a hand on his back. "We'll get through this, honey. We always do." Cody nodded, but the worry in his eyes didn't fade. That evening, the family gathered on the porch, the warm glow of lantern lights spilling out onto the wooden steps. The air was cool, and the stars were beginning to appear in the vast Oklahoma sky. Mona and Leanne were teasing each other as they braided their hair, while Emma sat in the rocking chair, a book in her lap. Sarah was leaning against the porch railing, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Thinking about Andy again?" Mona teased, her voice light and playful. Sarah shot her a look. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, come on," Leanne chimed in, her grin mischievous. "We've all seen the way you look at him." Emma smirked from behind her book. "And the way he looks at you." Sarah felt her cheeks flush, but she refused to rise to the bait. "He's just a ranch hand," she said, her voice firm. "Sure he is," Mona said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Before Sarah could respond, the sound of hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. Andy rode up to the house, his sandy blonde hair tousled from the ride, and his blue eyes sparkling in the lantern light. "Evening, ladies," he said, tipping his hat. "Evening, Andy," Emma said, her voice sweet as honey. Andy dismounted and walked up to the porch, his gaze lingering on Sarah. "I was just checking to see if you needed anything before I head back to the bunkhouse." "We're fine," Sarah said quickly, her voice a little too sharp. Mona and Leanne exchanged knowing looks, their grins widening. "Well, if you're sure," Andy said, his smile never wavering. He turned to leave, but then paused. Walked in closer to Sarah, face to face. "Oh, and Sarah?" Sarah looked up, her heart skipping a beat. "Yes?" Andy's smile softened. He whispered, "You're doing a great job out here. Your ma and pa's proud of you. We all are." Sarah felt her cheeks flush again, but this time she couldn't hide her smile. She whispered back, "Thanks, Andy." As Andy rode off into the night, Mona and Leanne burst into laughter. "Oh, he's just a ranch hand, huh?" Mona teased. Sarah rolled her eyes, but she couldn't stop the smile that tugged at her lips. The house was quiet. The only sounds, the creak of the porch swing and the distant call of a coyote. Cody and Jan were sitting together on the porch, holding hands as they watched the stars. "It's peaceful out here," Jan said, her voice soft. Cody nodded. "Too peaceful, sometimes." Jan frowned. "You're still worried about the fence, aren't you?" Cody sighed. "It's not just the fence, it's the whispers in town, the way folks look at us. This land is worth more than gold to some people, and they'll do whatever it takes to get it." Jan squeezed his hand. "We'll protect it, Cody. We just got here. This is our home." Before Cody could respond, a flicker of light caught his eye. He turned, his heart sinking as he saw flames licking at the edge of one of the barns. "Fire!" he shouted, jumping to his feet. The house erupted into chaos as the family scrambled to put out the flames. Cody and the ranch hands worked frantically, throwing buckets of water onto the fire, while Jan and the girls herded the animals to safety. "Get me some more water," Cody said. "Hurry!" By the time the fire was out, the barn was charred but still standing. Cody stood in the ashes, his face grim. "This wasn't an accident," he said, his voice stern. Jan placed a hand on his arm. "What do we do now?" Cody looked at his family, their faces streaked with soot, but their eyes filled with determination. "We fight," he said. "This is our home, and we're not giving it up." As the family stood together in the moonlight, the wildflowers swayed in the breeze, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the darkness that surrounded them. And in the shadows, unseen and unspoken, the threat loomed closer. Chapter 5. Ashes and Resolve. The morning after the fire, the Wagner ranch was eerily quiet. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air, a bitter reminder of the night before. The barn, though charred and blackened in places, had been saved, but the damage was enough to rattle the family. Cody stood in the yard, his hat in his hands, staring at the scorched wood as if willing it to repair itself. Jan came up behind him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "It could have been worse," she said softly. Cody nodded, his jaw tight. "But it shouldn't have happened at all. Someone's trying to scare us off, Jan." Jan's green eyes hardened. "They don't know us very well then. We're not the kind to scare easy." Cody turned to her, a small smile breaking through his grim expression. "That's why I married you." From the porch, Sarah called out, "Pa, we've got company!" Cody and Jan turned to see Sheriff Tom Hargrove riding up the dirt path, his horse kicking up small clouds of dust. His face was as grim as Cody's had been moments before. "Morning, Wagner," the sheriff said as he dismounted. "Heard about the fire. Figured I'd come by and see the damage for myself." Cody gestured toward the barn. "It's bad, but it could have been worse. We managed to save it." The sheriff nodded, his sharp eyes scanning the property. "Any idea who might have done it?" Cody shook his head. "No, but I've got my suspicions. Whoever's been cutting our fences might have decided to take things up a notch." The sheriff frowned. "I'll ask around town, see if anyone's been talking. But you need to be careful, Cody. Whoever's behind this isn't just trying to scare you. They're trying to drive you out." Cody's eyes narrowed. "Well, they're going to be disappointed. This is our land, and we're not going anywhere." The sheriff tipped his hat. "That's the spirit. Just keep your eyes open, and let me know if you see anything suspicious." As the sheriff rode off, Cody turned to his family, who had gathered on the porch. "All right, everyone," he said, his voice firm. "We've got work to do. That barn's not going to fix itself." The Wagner sisters threw themselves into the work, their usual banter and laughter subdued by the weight of the fire. Emma and Mona worked on cleaning up the barn, while Leanne helped Jan prepare lunch. Sarah, as always, was in the thick of things, hammering nails into a new section of the barn wall. Andy appeared mid-morning, his shirt already damp with sweat from working with the other ranch hands. He carried a stack of fresh lumber over one shoulder, his muscles straining under the weight. "Need a hand?" he asked, his blue eyes locking onto Sarah's. Sarah nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Thanks. We've got a lot to do." Andy set the lumber down and grabbed a hammer, falling into step beside her. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the sound of hammering filling the air. "You handled yourself well last night," Andy said after a while. Sarah glanced at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you didn't panic. You kept your head and got things done. Not everyone can do that." Sarah felt a blush, but kept her focus on the nail she was driving into the wood. "I didn't have much of a choice. There was too much at stake." Andy smiled, his gaze lingering on her. Still, it was impressive. From across the yard, Mona watched the exchange, her freckled face darkening with a mix of curiosity and something else, jealousy. She nudged Emma, who was sweeping out the barn. "Look at them," Mona said, her voice low. "He's practically drooling over her." Emma glanced over, her expression unreadable. "So what? Andy's just being nice." Mona snorted. "Nice? Please. He's got eyes for Sarah, and you know it." Emma shrugged, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that looked a lot like envy. That evening, the family gathered around the dinner table, the mood somber but determined. The fire had shaken them, but it hadn't broken them. "We need to be more careful," Cody said, his voice steady. "Whoever's behind this isn't going to stop. We need to be ready for whatever comes next." John nodded. "We'll take turns keeping watch at night, and we'll make sure the barn and house are stocked with water, just in case." The girls exchanged glances, their usual lightheartedness replaced by a shared resolve. "We'll do whatever it takes," Sarah said, her voice firm. Mona leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. "And what about Andy? He seems awfully eager to help out." Sarah shot her a sharp look. "What's that supposed to mean?" Mona shrugged, her tone casual, but her eyes gleaming. "Nothing. Just that he seems to spend a lot of time around you. Before Sarah could respond, Cody cleared his throat. That's enough, girls. We've got bigger things to worry about than who's spending time with who. The tension at the table eased, but the undercurrent of jealousy remained. Later that night, Sarah sat on the porch, the cool breeze brushing against her skin. The stars were bright overhead, their light reflecting off the Stillwater Creek. Andy appeared out of the darkness, his footsteps soft on the wooden steps. Couldn't sleep? He asked. Sarah shook her head. Too much on my mind. Andy sat down beside her, his presence warm and steady. You're worried about the fire. Sarah nodded. And everything else. The ranch. My family. It's a lot. Andy reached over, his hand brushing against hers. You're not alone, Sarah. You've got your family and you've got me. We'll get through this. Sarah looked at him somberly. Thanks, Andy. That means a lot. For a moment, they sat in silence, hands still touching, the sounds of the prairie filling the air. And in that quiet moment, Sarah felt a flicker of hope, a reminder that even in the face of danger, there was still light to be found. But as the night deepened, the shadows around the ranch seemed to grow even darker, and the threat that loomed over the Wagners felt closer than ever. Chapter 6. The Flames of Betrayal. The days following the fire were a blur of hard work and unease. The Wagner family threw themselves into rebuilding the barn and reinforcing the ranch's defenses, but the tension in the air was palpable. Cody and Jan kept a close eye on the property, while the sisters worked tirelessly to restore some sense of normalcy. Still, the whispers in town and the sheriff's warnings lingered in everyone's minds. Whoever had set the fire wasn't finished, and the Wagners knew it. It was late afternoon when Sarah spotted the figure. She was out by the creek, checking the fence line for any new damage, when she noticed a man on horseback in the distance. He was sitting just beyond the property line, his hat pulled low over his face. Sarah froze, her heart pounding. She couldn't make out his features, but something about the way he sat there, watching, sent a chill down her spine. "Who are you?" she called out, her voice steady, despite the fear creeping into her chest. The man didn't answer. Instead, he turned his horse and rode off, disappearing into the horizon. Sarah stood there for a moment, her fists clenched. Whoever he wasn't just passing through. When she returned to the house, Cody was on the porch, sharpening a knife. His face darkened when she told him about the stranger. "Did you recognize him?" Cody asked, his voice low. Sarah shook her head. "No, but he was watching the ranch. I'm sure of it." Cody's jaw tightened. "I'll talk to the sheriff. In the meantime, we'll keep a closer watch." That evening, the family gathered in the barn to finish repairing the last of the fire damage. The ranch hands were there too, including Andy, who had been working side by side with Sarah all day. As they worked, Andy couldn't help but steal glances at Sarah. She was focused, her sleeves rolled up, and her hair falling loose from its braid. There was something about her determination that drew him in, and he found himself smiling despite the tension in the air. Mona noticed. "Andy," she said, her voice light but pointed, "you've been awfully quiet tonight. Something on your mind?" Andy looked up, startled. "Just thinking about the work we've got left to do?" Mona smirked. "Or maybe you're thinking about Sarah." The barn went silent. Sarah froze, her hammer poised mid-swing, as everyone turned to look at her. "Mona," she said, her voice sharp, "don't start." "What?" Mona said, sounding innocent. "It's not like it's a secret. We've all seen the way he looks at you." Andy cleared his throat, his face turning red. "That's enough, Mona." But Mona wasn't finished. "I'm just saying, maybe you should be careful, Sarah. You wouldn't want to get distracted." Sarah slammed the hammer down on the workbench, her eyes blazing. "I'm not distracted, and maybe you should focus on your own work instead of sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." The tension in the barn was thick, but before anyone could say anything else, Cody's voice cut through the air. "That's enough," he barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. We've got more important things to worry about than petty squabbles. Get back to work. The sisters exchanged heated glances, but said nothing. The ranch was quiet that night. The only sounds, the rustle of the wind and the distant call of an owl. Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of the stranger by the creek and Mona's cutting words. Finally, she got up and went to the porch, hoping the cool night air would clear her head. She wasn't expecting to find Andy there, leaning against the railing with a faraway look in his eyes. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, stepping outside. Andy turned, his face softening when he saw her. "No, too much on my mind." Sarah joined him at the railing, the two of them standing in silence for a moment. "About earlier," Andy said finally, his voice low. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cause trouble between you and your sister." "It's not your fault," Sarah said. "Mona's just Mona. She likes to stir the pot." Andy chuckled. "Still, I don't want to make things harder for you." Sarah looked at him and stared for a moment, her heart softening. "You're not. If anything, you've made things easier. I don't know what we would have done without your help." Andy met her gaze, his blue eyes staring back. Leaning into her said, "I'd do anything for you, Sarah. You know that, right?" Sarah's breath caught, but before she could respond, a sound in the distance made them both freeze. It was faint, but unmistakable. The sound of hoofbeats. Andy straightened, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his belt. "Stay here," he said, his voice tense. "No way," Sarah said, grabbing the rifle that leaned against the porch. "I'm coming with you." Andy hesitated but nodded. Together, they stepped off the porch and into the darkness, their eyes scanning the horizon. The hoofbeats grew louder, then stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then a voice called out from the shadows. "This land doesn't belong to you, Wagner." Sarah's grip on the rifle tightened. "Who's there?" she shouted. There was no answer, only the sound of retreating hoofbeats as the intruder disappeared into the night. Andy placed a hand on her shoulder. "Let's get back to the house. Whoever that was, they're trying to scare you." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding. But as they walked back to the porch, she couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was closer than ever. The next morning, Cody gathered the family around the breakfast table. His face was grim, but his voice was steady. "We're not going to let them win," he said. "Whoever's behind this wants us to give up, but we're not going anywhere. This is our home, and we're going to fight for it." The family nodded, their resolve stronger than ever. But as Sarah glanced out the window at the charred barn and the distant creek, she couldn't help but wonder how far their enemies would go, and whether they were ready for what was coming. Chapter 7. Secrets and Suspicions. The days that followed were filled with a tense quiet. The Wagners continued their work on the ranch, but they were constantly on edge, watching for any sign of trouble. Cody had spoken to Sheriff Hargrove, who promised to keep an eye on things, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were on their own. The incident with the intruder had left her shaken, and she found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, wondering who was watching them and what they were planning. One afternoon, Sarah was out riding along the Stillwater Creek, trying to clear her head. The sun was warm on her face, and the gentle sound of the water was soothing, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. As she rounded a bend in the creek, she saw a figure sitting on the bank. It was Andy, his hat pulled low over his eyes. Sarah hesitated, unsure whether to approach him. After the incident in the barn, things had been awkward between them. She wasn't sure how to act or what to say. But as she watched him, she realized that he looked troubled. His shoulders were slumped, and his face was etched with worry. Driven by a sudden impulse, Sarah urged her horse forward. "Andy," she called out, "is everything all right?" Andy looked up, startled. His face softened when he saw her. "Hey, Sarah," he said, his voice quiet. "Just thinking." Sarah dismounted and walked over to him, her boots sinking into the soft earth. "About what?" she asked, sitting down beside him. Andy hesitated, then sighed. About this whole situation, the fire, the intruder, it's got me worried. Sarah nodded. Me too. I can't shake the feeling that something bad is going to happen. Andy looked at her, his blue eyes filled with concern. You need to be careful, Sarah. Whoever's behind this is dangerous. I know, Sarah said, her voice low. But what can we do? We can't just give up and leave. Andy shook his head. No, of course not. But you need to be smart. Don't take any unnecessary risks. Sarah smiled, touched by his concern. I appreciate that, Andy. But I can take care of myself. Andy chuckled. I know you can, but that doesn't mean I can't worry about you. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She looked at Andy, really looked at him, and realized that her feelings for him were growing stronger every day. She was drawn to his strength, his kindness, and his unwavering loyalty. But she also knew that a relationship with Andy would be complicated. Her sisters were already jealous, and she didn't want to cause any more friction within the family. Andy, she said, her voice hesitant, about us. Before she could finish, Andy reached out and took her hand. His touch sent a jolt of electricity through her. Sarah, he said, his voice low and earnest, I know things are complicated right now, but I can't deny the way I feel about you. I care about you more than you know. Sarah's breath caught. She looked into Andy's eyes and saw nothing but honesty and affection. I care about you too, Andy, she said softly, but I don't know if this is the right time. Andy squeezed her hand. I understand. We don't have to rush things, but I want you to know that I'm here for you, no matter what. Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with warmth. Thank you, Andy. That means the world to me. They sat in silence for a moment, their hands intertwined, the gentle sound of the creek filling the air. And in that quiet moment, as she put her head on his shoulder, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in days. Back at the ranch, Mona was watching from the window, her face a mask of jealousy. She had seen Sarah and Andy riding together, and she had a feeling that something was going on between them. What are you looking at? Emma asked, walking up behind her. Mona jumped, startled. Nothing, she said quickly. Just checking on the horses. Emma raised an eyebrow but didn't press the issue. She had her own suspicions about Sarah and Andy, and she wasn't sure how she felt about it. On the one hand, she was happy for Sarah. She deserved to find love and happiness. But on the other hand, she couldn't help feeling a twinge of envy. She had always been the responsible one, the one who took care of everyone else. She had never allowed herself to dream of romance or adventure. But now, seeing Sarah find happiness with Andy, she couldn't help wondering if she was missing out on something. Later that night, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Cody announced that he had made a decision. We're going to hire some extra help, he said, his voice firm. I want someone to keep watch at night, and someone to help with the chores during the day. The sisters exchanged glances, surprised. They hadn't expected Cody to take such a drastic step. Who are you going to hire? Jan asked. Cody hesitated, then said, I was thinking about asking Jake Miller. He's a good man, and he knows his way around a gun. Sarah's heart sank. Jake Miller was a notorious troublemaker, and she didn't trust him. She had a feeling that hiring him would only make things worse. Pa, she said, her voice hesitant, are you sure that's a good idea? I've heard some things about Jake Miller. Cody frowned. I know he's got a reputation, but he's the best we've got, and we need someone who can protect us. Sarah bit her lip, unsure how to argue. She didn't want to cause any more tension within the family, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Pa was making a mistake. As the family finished dinner, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what the future held. The ranch was under threat. Her family was divided, and her heart was torn between loyalty and love. She knew that the days ahead would be difficult, but she was determined to face whatever challenges came her way. She was a Wagner, and Wagners didn't give up without a fight. Chapter 8. A Storm on the Horizon. The Wagner ranch was quiet as the sun dipped below the horizon. The family had been working tirelessly to rebuild and protect their home, but the unease that had settled over them after the fire and the intruder's warning refused to lift. Sarah stood on the porch, her arms crossed as she watched the horizon. The sky was streaked with deep purples and oranges, but to the west, dark clouds were gathering. A storm was coming, and she couldn't help but feel that it was a sign of the trouble brewing around them. Behind her, the door creaked open, and Jan stepped out, a shawl draped over her shoulders. "You've been out here a while," she said gently. "What's on your mind?" Sarah sighed, her gaze never leaving the horizon. "Everything, Ma. The fire, the stranger by the creek, the whispers in town. It feels like we're fighting a battle we can't win." Jan placed a comforting hand on her daughter's shoulder. "We've faced hard times before, Sarah, and we've always come through stronger. This land is worth fighting for, and so is our family." Sarah turned to her mother, her eyes filled with worry. "But what if it's not enough? What if we lose everything?" Jan smiled softly, her green eyes steady. "Then we rebuild. That's what Wagners do. We don't give up, no matter what." Sarah nodded, her mother's words giving her a small measure of comfort. But deep down, the unease remained. The next morning, the family gathered in the yard as Cody introduced their new hire. Jake Miller was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and a sharp glint in his eyes. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and a gun belt slung low on his hips, giving him the air of someone who had seen his fair share of trouble. "Jake's here to help us keep an eye on things," Cody said, his tone firm. "He'll be patrolling the property at night and helping out with the chores during the day." Jake tipped his hat to the family. "Pleasure to meet you all," he said, his voice smooth, but with an edge that made Sarah's skin crawl. Mona, ever the flirt, stepped forward with a bright smile. "Welcome to the ranch, Mr. Miller. I'm Mona." Jake's lips curved into a slow smile. "Pleasure's all mine, Miss Mona." Sarah watched the exchange with a sinking feeling. She didn't trust Jake, and she didn't like the way he looked at her sister. But she kept her thoughts to herself, not wanting to cause a scene. As the family dispersed to begin their day's work, Andy pulled Sarah aside. "What do you think of him?" he asked, his voice low. Sarah glanced over at Jake, who was talking to Cody near the barn. "I don't trust him," she admitted. "There's something about him that doesn't sit right with me." Andy nodded, his expression grim. "I feel the same way. But your pa seems to think he's the best man for the job." Sarah sighed. "I just hope he doesn't make things worse." Tensions rise over the next few days. Jake settled into life on the ranch, but his presence only seemed to heighten the tension. He was a hard worker, but his sharp tongue and cocky demeanor rubbed some of the ranch hands the wrong way. Mona, however, seemed to enjoy his attention. She often found excuses to be near him, laughing at his jokes and hanging on his every word. Sarah tried to ignore it, but it was hard not to notice the way Jake's presence seemed to drive a wedge between her and her sister. One evening, as the family sat down to dinner, the tension finally boiled over. "Jake says he saw someone near the creek last night," Mona said, her tone casual but pointed. "He thinks it might have been one of the ranch hands from the neighboring property." Cody frowned. "Did he say who?" Mona shrugged. "No, but he said he'd keep an eye out." Sarah couldn't hold her tongue any longer. "And we're just supposed to take his word for it?" she asked, her voice sharp. Mona glared at her. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I don't trust him," Sarah said, her eyes flashing. "He's been here less than a week, and he's already stirring up trouble." Mona's face turned red. "You're just jealous because he's paying attention to me instead of you." The room fell silent, the weight of Mona's words hanging in the air. "That's enough," Cody said, his voice firm. "We're not going to start fighting with each other. We've got enough trouble as it is." Sarah pushed her chair back and stood. "I'm not hungry," she said, her voice tight. She left the table and stepped out onto the porch, the cool night air a welcome relief from the heat of the argument. Later that night, as Sarah sat on the porch, Andy joined her. He didn't say anything at first, just sat beside her and stared out at the darkened fields. "Rough night?" he asked after a while. Sarah nodded. "Mona thinks I'm jealous of Jake. Can you believe that?" Andy chuckled softly. "I can't say I blame her. He's got a way of getting under people's skin." Sarah sighed. "I just don't trust him, Andy. There's something about him that feels wrong." Andy's expression grew serious. "You're not the only one who feels that way. Some of the ranch hands have been talking. They think he's hiding something." Sarah looked at him, her heart sinking. "What do you mean?" Andy hesitated, then said, "I overheard him talking to someone in town yesterday. He was asking a lot of questions about your family, about the ranch. It didn't sit right with me." Sarah's stomach twisted. "Do you think he's involved in the fire? Or the intruder?" Andy shook his head. "I don't know, but I think we need to keep an eye on him." Sarah nodded, her resolve hardening. "We will. And if he's up to something, we'll find out." As the storm clouds gathered on the horizon, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. But she was determined to protect her family and their home, no matter what it took. Chapter 9. The Betrayal. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon finally broke, both in the skies above the Wagner ranch and within the family itself. Rain lashed against the windows of the house, and thunder rumbled in the distance. But it was the tension inside that felt most dangerous. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. Her mind was racing, replaying Andy's words from the night before. Jake Miller was asking questions about the family and the ranch. Why? What was he after? Across the room, Mona was humming to herself as she braided her hair, seemingly oblivious to the storm outside, or the one brewing between her and Sarah. "You're awfully cheerful this morning," Sarah said, unable to keep the edge out of her voice. Mona glanced at her, a sly smile playing on her lips. "Why shouldn't I be? Jake and I are going riding later. He said he wants to show me something near the creek." Sarah's stomach twisted. "You're spending a lot of time with him." Mona's smile faded and her eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you don't know anything about him," Sarah said, her voice rising. "He's been here less than 2 weeks, and you're acting like he's your best friend." Mona stood, her chair scraping against the floor. "And you're acting like you're in charge of everyone. Just because you're Pa's favorite doesn't mean you get to tell me who I can and can't spend time with." Sarah's face flushed with anger. "This isn't about me being in charge, Mona. It's about keeping this family safe, and I don't trust him." "Well, maybe that's your problem," Mona snapped. "Not mine." Before Sarah could respond, the door swung open, and Cody stepped inside, rain dripping from his hat and coat. He looked between his daughters, his expression grim. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "Nothing," Mona said quickly, grabbing her shawl. "I'm going riding." Cody frowned. "In this weather?" Mona shrugged. "Jake's waiting for me. We'll be fine." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but Cody held up a hand. "Let her go," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Mona shot Sarah a triumphant look before slipping out the door. The rain had eased by the time Mona and Jake reached the creek. The water was higher than usual, rushing over the rocks with a force that made Mona shiver. Jake dismounted and tied his horse to a tree, then turned to Mona with a smile. "Beautiful spot, isn't it?" Mona nodded, though her unease was growing. Something about Jake's demeanor had changed. He was still smiling, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "What did you want to show me?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Jake's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I wanted to talk to you about your family. About the ranch." Mona frowned. "What about it?" Jake stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, almost menacing tone. "You know, this land is worth a lot of money, more than your pa probably realizes, and there are people who'd pay a pretty penny to get their hands on it." Mona's heart began to race. "What are you talking about?" Jake's smile disappeared, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. I'm saying your family's sitting on a gold mine, and they don't even know it, but I do. And I've got people who are very interested in making sure this land changes hands. Mona took a step back, her breath coming in short gasps. You! You're the one who set the fire, aren't you? Jake didn't deny it. Let's just say I've been helping things along. But it doesn't have to be this way, Mona. You could help me, convince your family to sell, and no one else has to get hurt. Mona stared at him, her mind racing. She had been so caught up in his charm, so eager for his attention, that she hadn't seen the truth. And now, she was standing face to face with a man who had betrayed her family. "I'll never help you," she said, her voice trembling but firm. Jake's expression darkened. "That's a shame. I was hoping you'd be smarter than this." Before Mona could react, Jake grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. "You're coming with me," he said, dragging her toward his horse. Back at the ranch, Sarah was pacing the porch, her unease growing with every passing minute. The rain had stopped, but the dark clouds still hung low in the sky, casting an ominous shadow over the land. Andy rode up, his horse lathered with sweat. "Sarah!" he called out, his voice urgent. "I just saw Jake heading toward the creek with Mona. Something didn't feel right." Sarah's heart dropped. "We have to go after them." Andy nodded. "I'll saddle your horse." Within minutes, they were riding hard toward the creek, the wind whipping through their hair. Sarah's mind raced with fear and anger. She had been right about Jake all along, and now Mona was in danger because no one had listened. When they reached the creek, they saw Jake struggling to lift Mona onto his horse. She was fighting him, her screams echoing through the trees. "Let her go!" Sarah shouted, raising the rifle she had brought with her. Jake froze, his eyes narrowing as he turned to face her. "Stay out of this, Sarah. This doesn't concern you." "Oh, yes, it does," Andy said, dismounting and drawing his pistol. "Let her go, Jake, or I'll put a bullet in you right now." Jake hesitated, his eyes darting between Sarah and Andy. Finally, he released Mona, shoving her towards Sarah. "This isn't over," he said, mounting his horse. "You've made a big mistake." As Jake rode off, Sarah ran to Mona, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice shaking. Mona nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. You were right about him. I should have listened." Sarah held her sister close, her own tears falling. "It's okay. You're safe now. That's all that matters." Andy watched the sisters, gritting his teeth. "We need to tell your pa," he said. "Jake's not going to stop. He'll be back." Sarah nodded. "All right, let him come. We'll be ready." As they rode back to the ranch, the storm clouds began to break, revealing a sliver of sunlight on the horizon. But Sarah knew the real storm was still ahead, and this time they would have to fight with everything they had to protect their home and each other. Chapter 10. The Fight for the Ranch. The Wagner ranch was quiet, but the tension in the air was palpable. The events at the creek had shaken everyone, and the family knew that Jake Miller's betrayal was only the beginning. Pa had called a meeting in the barn, the one place that still felt like a sanctuary after the fire. The family and ranch hands gathered in a tight circle, their faces grim. Cody stood at the center, his broad shoulders squared, and his voice steady. "Jake's made his intentions clear," Cody said, his eyes scanning the group. "He's working with someone, maybe a group, who wants this land, and they're not going to stop until they get it." Jan, standing beside him, nodded. "We've faced hard times before, and we've always come through. But this is different. This is a fight for our home, for everything we've built." Sarah stepped forward, her voice firm. "We can't let them win. We need to be ready for whatever they throw at us." Andy, leaning against a post, spoke up. "Jake knows the ranch. He knows the land, the weak spots in the fences, and where we keep the cattle. We need to shore up our defenses and keep watch around the clock." Cody nodded. "Andy's right. We'll set up patrols day and night, and we'll make sure everyone knows how to defend themselves." Mona, her face pale but determined, raised her hand. "I want to help. I know I made a mistake trusting Jake, but I want to make it right." Pa's expression softened. You're part of this family, Mona. We all make mistakes. What matters is that we stand together now. Emma, ever the practical one, added, we should also talk to the sheriff. If Jake's working with others, we need to know who they are and what they're planning. Cody nodded. I'll ride into town tomorrow and speak with Hargrove. In the meantime, everyone needs to stay alert. We can't afford to let our guard down. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She sat on the porch, her rifle resting across her lap, as the cool night air wrapped around her. The stars above were bright, but they offered little comfort. Andy joined her, his footsteps soft on the wooden planks. Couldn't sleep? He asked, sitting down beside her. Sarah shook her head. Too much on my mind. Andy leaned back, his gaze fixed on the horizon. You're worried about what's coming. Sarah nodded. I keep thinking about what Jake said, that this land is worth more than we realize. What if there's something here we don't know about? Something that's making them desperate enough to do all this? Andy frowned, his jaw tightening. It's possible. But whatever it is, it doesn't change the fact that this is your family's home, and no one has the right to take it from you. Sarah looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. Thank you, Andy, for everything. I don't know what we'd do without you. Andy met her gaze, his blue eyes steady. You don't have to thank me, Sarah. I'm here because I want to be. Because I care about you. Sarah's breath caught, and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift. She reached out, her hand brushing against his. I care about you too, Andy. The moment was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats in the distance. Both of them tensed, their hands going to their weapons. Stay here, Andy said, standing and moving toward the edge of the porch. No way, Sarah said, rising to her feet. I'm coming with you. Andy didn't argue. Together they stepped into the yard, their eyes scanning the darkness. The hoofbeats grew louder, and then a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Sheriff Hargrove, his face grim as he dismounted. Evening, Wagners, he said, tipping his hat. I've got news. Cody and Jan appeared in the doorway, followed by the rest of the family. What is it, Sheriff? Cody asked. Hargrove sighed. I've been asking around town, and it seems Jake's been working with a man named Jed Grady. He's a land speculator, and he's been buying up property all over the territory. Word is, he's got his eye on your ranch because of the creek. He wants to dam it up and sell the water rights. Cody's face darkened. So that's what this is about. Hargrove nodded. Jed doesn't play fair. He's got money, men, and no conscience. If he wants something, he takes it, and he doesn't care who gets hurt in the process. Jan's hand tightened on Cody's arm. What do we do? Hargrove looked at the family, his expression serious. You fight, you stand your ground, and show him you're not going anywhere. But be careful. Jed Grady won't back down easily. The next day, the ranch was a hive of activity. The family and ranch hands worked together to reinforce the fences, secure the barn, and set up watch points around the property. Sarah and Andy worked side by side, their bond growing stronger with each passing hour. Despite the danger, Sarah felt a sense of hope. They were prepared, and they were united. As the sun set, casting the ranch in a golden glow, Cody gathered everyone in the yard. This is our home, he said, his voice strong. We've worked too hard and come too far to let anyone take it from us. We're going to fight for this land, for our family, and for our future. And we're going to win. The group cheered, their spirits lifted by Cody's words. But as the night fell and the stars appeared, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. In the distance, hidden in the shadows, Jake Miller watched the ranch. He smirked, his eyes gleaming with malice. They think they can stop us, he muttered, but they have no idea what's coming. Behind him, Jed Grady stepped forward, his presence cold and commanding. Let them prepare, he said, his voice low and dangerous. It'll make it all the sweeter when we take everything from them. As the two men disappeared into the night, the Wagner family stood ready, unaware of the storm that was about to descend upon them. Chapter 11. The Battle for Stillwater. The Wagner ranch was cloaked in an uneasy silence as dawn broke over the horizon. The golden light of the rising sun bathed the fields of wildflowers, but the beauty of the morning was lost on the family. They knew today would bring a reckoning. Cody stood on the porch, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his face set in a grim expression. Jan was beside him, her hands clasped tightly together. The girls were gathered nearby, each of them armed and ready. Even Mona, who had been shaken by Jake's betrayal, stood tall, her face set with determination. Andy and the ranch hands were scattered across the property, keeping watch from the fences in the barn. They had spent the night preparing for what was to come, reinforcing weak points and setting up defensive positions. Sarah stood beside Andy near the barn, her heart pounding in her chest. She had barely slept, her mind racing with thoughts of what might happen. But now, as the sun rose and the moment of truth drew closer, she felt a strange sense of calm. "We're ready," Andy said, his voice steady. Sarah nodded, gripping her rifle tightly. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Andy looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a mix of determination and something deeper. "I won't let anything happen to you, Sarah, I promise." Sarah's heart swelled, but before she could respond, a shout rang out from the edge of the property. "They're coming!" The first sign of trouble was the sound of hoofbeats, a low rumble that grew louder with each passing second. Then, through the dust rising on the horizon, a group of riders appeared. At the head of the group was Jed Grady, his sharp features twisted into a cruel smile. Beside him was C.E.Mallery, his eyes cold and calculating. Cody stepped forward, his rifle raised. "This is private property," he called out. "Turn around and leave, or you'll regret it." Jed pulled his horse to a stop, his men fanning out behind him. Now, Mr. Wagner," he said, his voice smooth and mocking. "No need to be so hostile. I'm just here to make you an offer." "We're not selling," Cody said firmly. Jed's smile widened. "Oh, I think you'll reconsider. You see, I've got the resources to make your life very difficult. Fires, broken fences, missing cattle. Those were just warnings. If you don't sell, things are going to get a lot worse." Cody's grip on his rifle tightened. "You can threaten us all you want, but this is our home. We're not going anywhere." Jed's smile disappeared, replaced by a sneer. "Have it your way." He turned to his men and raised his hand. "Take the ranch." The battle began in an instant. Jed's men charged forward, their horses kicking up clouds of dust as they rode toward the house and barn. Shots rang out, the sharp cracks echoing across the property. Cody and the ranch hands fired from their positions, their aim steady and true. Andy was at the forefront, his pistol blazing as he took down one of Jed's men. Sarah was in the barn, her heart pounding as she fired at the attackers. She had never been in a gunfight before, but her determination to protect her family gave her strength. Mona and Emma were in the house, firing from the windows. Jan was with them, reloading rifles and keeping a watchful eye on her daughters. Lee Ann, the youngest, was in the loft of the barn, her sharp eyes scanning the battlefield. She spotted Jake sneaking around the side of the barn and shouted a warning. "Sarah, he's coming your way!" Sarah turned just in time to see Jake appear in the doorway, his gun drawn. Well, he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Looks like it's just you and me, Sarah." Sarah raised her rifle, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her. "You don't have to do this, Jake. Walk away." Jake laughed, a cold, bitter sound. "It's too late for that. Jed's paying me too much to back down now." Before Sarah could respond, Jake lunged at her, knocking the rifle from her hands. The two of them struggled, their movements frantic and desperate. Sarah fought with everything she had, her mind racing as she tried to find a way to escape. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw Andy running toward the barn. "Get away from her!" Andy shouted, tackling Jake to the ground. The two men grappled, their fists flying as they rolled across the barn floor. Sarah scrambled to her feet, grabbing her rifle and aiming it at Jake. "Andy, move!" she shouted. Andy rolled to the side just as Sarah fired, the shot grazing Jake's arm. He cried out in pain, clutching his wound as he glared at her. "This isn't over," he spat, before scrambling to his feet and running out of the barn. Outside, the tide of the battle was turning. Jed's men were retreating, their numbers dwindling as the Wagners and their ranch hands held their ground. Jed, realizing he was outmatched, turned his horse and rode off, shouting curses over his shoulder. Cody lowered his rifle, his chest heaving as he watched the attackers disappear into the distance. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with relief. Jan ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck. "We're safe," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Sarah and Andy emerged from the barn, their faces streaked with dirt and sweat. Mona and Emma ran to them, pulling Sarah into a tight embrace. "I'm so sorry," Mona said, her voice trembling. "I should have listened to you." Sarah hugged her sister tightly. "It's okay. We're all safe, and that's what matters." Andy stood nearby, his eyes locked on Sarah. When she pulled away from her sisters, he stepped forward, his expression softening. "We make a pretty good team," he said, his voice low. Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude and something deeper. "I couldn't have done it without you." Andy reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're beautiful, Sarah, and I'm proud of you." For a moment, the chaos of the day faded away, and it was just the two of them, standing together in the golden light of the setting sun. As the family gathered on the porch that evening, the ranch was quiet once more. The battle was over, but the scars it left behind would take time to heal. Cody looked at his family, his heart swelling with pride. "We stood our ground," he said, "and we won. This is our home, and no one's going to take it from us." The family cheered, their voices ringing out across the prairie. But as Sarah sat beside Andy, her hand resting in his, she couldn't help but wonder what the future held. They had won the battle, but the war for their home, and their hearts, was far from over. Chapter 12. A New Dawn. The Wagner Ranch was quiet in the early morning light, the golden sun rising over the fields of wildflowers, with a gently breeze. The Stillwater Creek sparkled like a ribbon of silver, its calm currents a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded just days before. The battle for the ranch had been won, but the scars it left behind were still fresh. The barn bore bullet holes, the fences were damaged, and the family was exhausted. Yet, as the sun rose, it brought with it a sense of hope, a promise of a new beginning. Sarah stood on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself as she watched the sunrise. The events of the past weeks played over in her mind. The fire, Jake's betrayal, the attack on the ranch. It had been the hardest fight of her life, but they had survived. Behind her, the door creaked open, and Andy stepped out, his boots thudding softly against the wooden planks. He carried 2 mugs of coffee, steam rising from the cups. "Thought you could use this," he said, handing her one. Sarah smiled, taking the mug. "Thanks." Andy leaned against the porch railing, his blue eyes scanning the horizon. "It's beautiful out here," he said. "Peaceful." Sarah nodded. "It is. For the first time in a long time, it feels like we can breathe again." Andy turned to her, his expression soft. "You were incredible, Sarah. The way you fought for your family, for this land. I've never seen anything like it." Sarah looked down at her coffee, her cheeks flushing. "I didn't do it alone. I couldn't have." Andy reached out, gently tilting her chin up so she was looking at him. "You're stronger than you think, Sarah, and I'm proud of you." Her heart swelled at his words, and for a moment, the world seemed to fade away. It was just the two of them, standing together in the golden light of the morning. "Andy," she said softly, "I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want you to be a part of it." Andy's smile widened, and he took her hand in his. "I'm not going anywhere, Sarah. I'll be by your side, no matter what." As their hands intertwined, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in weeks. Inside the house, the rest of the family was beginning to stir. Cody was at the kitchen table, going over plans to repair the fences and rebuild the barn. Jan was bustling around the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared breakfast. Mona and Emma were sitting by the window, their heads close together as they whispered and giggled. The tension between them had eased, and their bond as sisters was stronger than ever. Leanne burst into the room, her face flushed with excitement. "Pa! There's a wagon coming up the road!" Cody stood, his hand instinctively going to the rifle leaning against the wall. "Who is it?" Leanne grinned. "It's Sheriff Hargrove." Moments later, the sheriff arrived, his horse kicking up dust as he pulled to a stop in front of the house. Cody and Jan stepped out to greet him, followed by the rest of the family. "Morning, Wagners," Hargrove said, tipping his hat. "Thought I'd stop by and check on you all." "We're doing all right, Sheriff," Cody said. "Thanks to you and the men who helped us." Hargrove nodded. "You've got a strong family, Cody, and a strong community behind you. Jed Grady won't be bothering you anymore. He and his men were picked up in another town for killing a man. Don't think you'll ever see them again." A collective sigh of relief swept through the family. "That's good to hear," Jan said, her voice filled with gratitude. Hargrove smiled. "You've earned this land, Wagners, and you've earned the respect of everyone in Stillwater. If you ever need anything, you know where to find me." As the sheriff rode off, Cody turned to his family, his face filled with pride. "We did it," he said. "We stood our ground, and we won." The days that followed were filled with hard work, but also with joy. The family repaired the fences, rebuilt the barn, and planted new crops. The ranch began to heal, just as the family did. Sarah and Andy grew closer with each passing day, their bond deepening as they worked side by side. The other sisters teased Sarah endlessly, but she didn't mind. For the first time in her life, she felt truly happy. One evening, as the sun set over the ranch, Andy took Sarah's hand and led her to the creek. The water glimmered in the fading light, and the wildflowers swayed gently in the breeze. "I've been thinking," Andy said, his voice soft, "about the future, about us." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What about us?" Andy turned to her, his blue eyes filled with emotion. "I want to build a life with you, Sarah. Here, on this land. I want to be a part of your family, a part of this ranch. If you'll have me." Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she smiled. "Of course I'll have you, Andy. I can't imagine my life without you." Andy grinned, pulling her into his arms. "I love you, Sarah Wagner." "I love you too, Andy," she whispered. As they stood by the creek, the sun dipping below the horizon, Sarah felt a sense of peace and hope she hadn't felt in a long time. The ranch was safe, her family was strong, and her heart was full. The Wagner family gathered on the porch that night, the stars shining brightly overhead. They laughed, told stories, and dreamed of the future. The ranch had been tested, but it had endured, and so had they. As the wildflowers swayed in the breeze, their vibrant colors glowing in the moonlight, the Wagners knew that they had found their place in the world, a place where love, faith, and family would always prevail. And as Sarah leaned against Andy, her hand resting in his, she knew that the best was yet to come. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the heart of the West. We hope you enjoyed this glimpse into a world of romance, adventure, and the enduring spirit of the frontier. If you loved the story, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more Western tales filled with passion, drama, and the untamed beauty of the American West.